The sound of the gate slamming still echoes in my head. It was there, in front of a church covered in white flowers, that the family I'd served for over 30 years decided to erase me from history. I just wanted to say goodbye. That was all. But in their eyes, a woman like me didn't even have the right to mourn. The cold morning wind mingled the scent of incense with the daughters-in-law's expensive perfume, and I knew the moment I walked through the door that this would be no ordinary wake. The gazes pierced me like blades. Some looked away quickly, others lingered long enough to remind me of my place. "This isn't for you," a voice murmured near the entrance. And even without looking up, I understood. Rejection has a sound, a rhythm, a specific silence. And that day it spread to every corner of the chapel. The coffin stood in the center, surrounded by wreaths and hypocrisy. The man inside taught me respect. He was the one who gave me trouble when no one else believed in me. He was the one who said I was part of the family. And now, that same family treated me like an intruder, a stain on a scene they wanted to be perfect. There was a moment when I considered going home, pretending I hadn't heard anything. But something inside me refused to back down. I knew there was something more to that day. A secret, a truth no one wanted to see. The eldest daughter approached. Her heels tapped firmly on the floor, marking the rhythm of her humiliation. "You're in the wrong place," she said, with a smile too polite to hide her venom. And when everyone turned to me, expecting me to shrink away, I simply took a deep breath. Fear and shame mingled, but there was also a strange calm. The same calm that precedes the rain. Because deep down I knew that day wouldn't end the way they imagined. The murmur of voices spread through the church, a buzz of disguised curiosity. I saw the expressions, raised eyebrows, suppressed laughter, whispers that tried to be discreet. And I wondered, why such a rush to leave? What fear is this that makes a family deny even the presence of the one who brought only care? The coffin seemed heavier than ever. The candlelight wavered as if it, too, wavered between respect and truth. Each flame reflected a different figure on the walls, shadows dancing to the rhythm of tension. This was not a place for farewell. It was a battlefield fought in silence. It was at that moment that I heard the door open behind me. Firm footsteps, a deep voice calling my name. The murmur ceased, and the chill that had previously run down my spine gave way to something else entirely, the feeling that fate was about to change sides. Those who looked at me with contempt never imagined that this would be the beginning of the end of lies. Because what is written, not even the most arrogant pride can erase. And the name they tried to silence was about to echo loudly. Name. When that voice spoke my name, I felt time stand still. It was as if all the air had been sucked from the chapel. Conversations ceased, and even the candles seemed frozen in the flame. The lawyer approached slowly, a dark folder in his hands, and in that silent movement, I understood that something profound was about to happen. The faces that had previously regarded me with contempt now turned to him, confused, trying to understand what a woman like me could have to do with this man everyone thought they knew. As he walked to the front, my mind flashed back to the days when the boss was still breathing. I remembered his husky voice, the sound of his hands slapping the table as he laughed at my stories, the way he thanked me for each carefully served cup of coffee. He always said that respect was the only luxury you should never deny anyone. And it was precisely this respect that made me stay by his side until his last breath, when the house was empty of children and filled with silence. But not everyone saw it that way. To the family, I was just a convenient shadow, a useful presence, but too uncomfortable to acknowledge. The black woman who knew the house's secrets but had to content herself with invisibility. And at that wake, that invisibility became a uniform they insisted on making me wear again. I could see them whispering among themselves, adjusting their collars and expressions, as if trying to erase my existence from the eyes of others. The lawyer cleared his throat. The sound echoed like thunder in the silent room. He opened his briefcase, took out some papers and began to speak. And I, standing there, felt my heartbeat with a rhythm that mixed fear and relief. Because something told me that this man, even after death, still had one last word to say. People looked at each other in confusion. My eldest daughter gave me looks of concealed anger, while my grandchildren tried to understand what was happening. I could feel the unease growing in the air, an unease that no longer belonged to me. For the first time, I wasn't the one to blame, nor the outsider. I was the reason for their bewilderment. The lawyer then mentioned my name again, this time clearly, and the words that followed sounded like a sentence impossible to undo. I didn't understand all the legal jargon, but I understood the gist. That man had left me something. And it wasn't a small amount. There was a murmur, a collective sound of disbelief. The daughter-in-law who had earlier thrown me out stepped forward, trying to interrupt, but the lawyer stood firm, reading every line, every word, with a calmness that hurt their pride more than any shout. I could feel the ground vibrate beneath my feet. It was as if, after so many years of silence, life was finally giving me back my voice. It was strange because in the midst of that chaos, I didn't feel revenge, felt justice. I felt the weight of the years slowly lifting from my shoulders. And perhaps that's why so many people choose to stay here, following each revelation, because they know what it's like to carry the burden of the invisible and suddenly be seen. The lawyer finished reading. His name, mine, and the signature on the paper. All official, all indisputable. But what came next? The looks, the whispers, the desperate attempt to deny the inevitable, was the true beginning of what was yet to come. I knew that this will was not just a document. It was the mirror that would reveal who each of them truly was. And the image they would see, I was certain, would not be pretty. The silence after the reading was more deafening than any scream. I could hear the sound of rapid breathing, the soft creak of the wooden benches, the snap of the eldest daughter's restless fingers as she tried to maintain her composure. It was the kind of silence that carries hatred and shame mixed together. I stood motionless, hands clasped in front of me, observing every expression, every change of color on the faces that had once treated me as invisible. The lawyer's gaze met mine for a brief moment, and in that gaze was a kind of silent respect, the same one the old man had always offered me in life. The eldest daughter was the first to break the spell. "This is absurd," she screamed, her voice echoing off the walls like misplaced thunder. "That woman must have manipulated him. My father didn't know what he was doing." Her words hit me hard, but I didn't react. Not because they didn't hurt, but because I knew they weren't new. They were just the echo of all the small humiliations that had repeated themselves over the years. The suspicious look when I served dinner, the curt tone when I asked for a day off, the conversations that stopped when I entered the room. The difference now was that none of that could change what was written. The others began to rise. One of the sons grabbed the lawyer by the arm, demanding an explanation. The daughter-in-law, still pale, fanned herself with the funeral program, as if the air had suddenly grown denser. And it had. The scent of flowers mixed with expensive perfume was now making me nauseous. I could have sworn the casket itself, right there in front of me, seemed to watch everything silently, as if the man lying there had planned this very moment. I wanted to feel anger, but what was growing inside me was something else. A kind of ancient sadness, mixed with lucidity. Because deep down I knew it wasn't the money nor the inheritance that really hurt them. It was the fact that their father had recognized in me something they had never been able to offer. Loyalty. They couldn't bear to see it in front of others. It was like a mirror that forced them to face their own ingratitude. Outside, the sky was beginning to change color. The heavy clouds seemed to herald rain, and the wind made the candles flutter in people's hands. The scene had something symbolic, as if nature itself knew this was the end of an era. Not just for them, but for me as well. The lawyer called for silence and confirmed what everyone feared. The will was legitimate, dated, signed, and registered. No contestation was possible. His words sounded like hammer blows on stone. The whispers grew louder, and a heat rose from the chapel floor as if their shame burned the air. The eldest daughter, desperate, tried to move her father's body to another location, but no one moved. The audience watched with a mixture of embarrassment and curiosity, and I felt a shiver run through me. Revenge, without me having to lift a finger, was being carried out there. public, inevitable, absolute. Even so, something inside me whispered that this wasn't the end. That the will, though it was the trigger, wasn't the whole story. There was still something hidden, one last gesture, a memory hidden somewhere in the big house that could change everything once again. The rain began to fall lightly, washing the floor and steps of the chapel. I took a step back, took a deep breath, and felt the scent of wet earth mingle with the scent of flowers. The lawyer carefully closed the folder, and in that dry sound of paper being put away, I realized that the true weight of what had happened was yet to come. After the reading, the air felt lighter and thicker at the same time. The people were still there, but it was as if they and I were in different worlds. Each of my breaths seemed to echo in that space where I had no right to exist before. I watched my eldest daughter walk away, tripping on her heels, as if trying to escape not from me, but from her own shame. The lawyer gathered up the papers in silence, while the whispers became distant murmurs. And I stood there, staring at the coffin, trying to understand what it all really meant. I thought of him, of the man who called me my confidence, who let his coffee grow cold as he listened to me talk about my mother, my grandson, the simple life I led outside that enormous house. I thought of the times he'd said loneliness was the worst of diseases and how, in recent years, it was the two of us who filled each other's void. There was nothing grandiose about it, just humanity. And perhaps that was why he wanted my name to remain after his was gone. Outside, the rain grew heavier. People began to leave, some without looking back. I stood, watching the drops run down the stained glass windows, forming paths of distorted light on the ground. It all seemed too symbolic to be coincidence. The water fell as if washing away the house, the history, everyone's guilt. And amidst that constant sound, I realized that the weight of humiliation I had carried for so many years was finally beginning to dissolve. But what surprised me most wasn't the value of the inheritance, nor the family's reaction. It was the way the silence of those around me began to change. A group of neighbors, who had previously pretended not to see me when I walked through the streets in my maid's apron, now looked at me differently. There was curiosity, yes, but also respect. It was as if they had suddenly awakened to the fact that I had always been there, not as a supporting actor, but as a witness. And it is at this point that many feel the urge to support this journey, leaving a silent sign that the message has touched them. Inside, the eldest daughter returned. She was wet, her eyes red, her face pale. "He couldn't have done that," she said, her voice trembling. I didn't answer. There was nothing to say. What could explain the difference between what she believed she deserved and what she actually earned? I think it was at that moment that I understood that justice isn't just about receiving what's ours, but also about seeing the truth come to its rightful place. That will wasn't about money. It was about dignity. About a man who, at the end of his life, had the courage to acknowledge who was truly there for him. When I left the chapel, the sky was already lightening. The smell of wet earth brought a sense of new beginnings. With each step, I felt as if I were saying goodbye not only to him, but also to the woman who once lowered her head to fit into the spaces others allowed. There was still much to face, I knew. The lawsuits, the gossip, the family's attempts to undo what had been done. But inside me, there was a new, almost warm serenity, like a quiet fire lit in my chest. The certainty that nothing can erase what has been achieved with loyalty. And as the rain stopped, I sensed something even greater awaited me, not as a threat, but as a revelation. Because some stories don't end when the truth is told. They just change tone. And mine was still far from silent. After the reading, the air felt lighter and thicker at the same time. The people were still there, but it was as if they and I were in different worlds. Each of my breaths seemed to echo in that space where I had no right to exist before. I watched my eldest daughter walk away, tripping on her heels, as if trying to escape not from me, but from her own shame. The lawyer gathered up the papers in silence, while the whispers became distant murmurs. And I stood there, staring at the coffin, trying to understand what it all really meant. I thought of him, of the man who called me my confidence, who let his coffee grow cold as he listened to me talk about my mother, my grandson, the simple life I led outside that enormous house. I thought of the times he'd said loneliness was the worst of diseases and how, in recent years, it was the two of us who filled each other's void. There was nothing grandiose about it, just humanity. And perhaps that was why he wanted my name to remain after his was gone. Outside, the rain grew heavier. People began to leave, some without looking back. I stood, watching the drops run down the stained glass windows, forming paths of distorted light on the ground. It all seemed too symbolic to be coincidence. The water fell as if washing away the house, the history, everyone's guilt. And amidst that constant sound, I realized that the weight of humiliation I had carried for so many years was finally beginning to dissolve. But what surprised me most wasn't the value of the inheritance, nor the family's reaction. It was the way the silence of those around me began to change. A group of neighbors, who had previously pretended not to see me when I walked through the streets in my maid's apron, now looked at me differently. There was curiosity, yes, but also respect. It was as if they had suddenly awakened to the fact that I had always been there, not as a supporting actor, but as a witness. And it is at this point that many feel the urge to support this journey, leaving a silent sign that the message has touched them. Inside, the eldest daughter returned. She was wet, her eyes red, her face pale. "He couldn't have done that," she said, her voice trembling. I didn't answer. There was nothing to say. What could explain the difference between what she believed she deserved and what she actually earned? I think it was at that moment that I understood that justice isn't just about receiving what's ours, but also about seeing the truth come to its rightful place. That will wasn't about money. It was about dignity. About a man who, at the end of his life, had the courage to acknowledge who was truly there for him. When I left the chapel, the sky was already lightening. The smell of wet earth brought a sense of new beginnings. With each step, I felt as if I were saying goodbye not only to him, but also to the woman who once lowered her head to fit into the spaces others allowed. There was still much to face, I knew. The lawsuits, the gossip, the family's attempts to undo what had been done. But inside me, there was a new, almost warm serenity, like a quiet fire lit in my chest. The certainty that nothing can erase what has been achieved with loyalty. And as the rain stopped, I sensed something even greater awaited me, not as a threat, but as a revelation. Because some stories don't end when the truth is told. They just change tone. And mine was still far from silent. The days following that wake were like walking on glass. Everything seemed calm on the outside, but all it took was one misstep for the death to happen. The news spread faster than I imagined. On every corner, there was someone willing to comment on the will, repeat my name in astonishment, invent new versions of what had happened between me and the deceased. People love to talk when the truth bothers them. And curiously, the more they talked, the more I realized how much that story wasn't just mine. It was about how the world treats those who serve and forgets those who provide. I continued to live in the small house at the back of the old property, the one he had officially left me. And every time I crossed the garden, I felt the wind blowing against the curtains of the main house, now closed and silent. It was as if the house breathed memories. The sound of his footsteps still seemed to echo through the hallways. The smell of his cigar, the sound of newspaper pages being turned. His quiet laugh when I called him stubborn. Everything remained there, imbued in the walls. And I, alone among the flowers I had planted with my own hands, tried to understand what came after justice. There were moments of light and others of shadow. Sometimes I'd sit on the porch with a cup of coffee and watch the sky change colors, feeling the relief of finally being seen. Other times, doubt haunted me. Did I have the right to accept this gift? Did he truly imagine the magnitude of the storm he would leave behind? The inheritance freed me, but it also isolated me. It was the kind of victory that came with loneliness. His daughters didn't give up easily. They tried to appeal, to contest, to make up stories to paint me as manipulative. I received dirty looks on the street, anonymous notes, even veiled threats. But none of it compared to the weight of the years they made me believe I was nobody. I knew how to resist the contempt. What hurt now was the silence. The silence of the house, the silence of a broken bond, the silence of the memories that came at night, when I lay and listened to the distant sound of rain tapping on the roof. It was strange to miss him. Even with everything that came after, there was a longing that couldn't be explained. An absence that seeped into the little things. The set table, the clock he always forgot to wind, the folded newspaper in the corner of the room. Perhaps what held me captive wasn't just the memory of the man, but the recognition he offered me in the end. The validation the world had always denied me. The contrast between what I gained and what I lost was almost cruel. I gained a name, dignity, independence. But I lost the familiar ground, the predictable rhythm of the days, the routine that, though harsh, was familiar to me. Now each morning felt like a blank page, and I was still learning to write my own destiny without apologizing for existing. Sometimes at dusk, I'd feel a light presence on the porch, as if the wind were bringing back something that had been left hanging. It wasn't fear, it was just a feeling that the story hadn't completely closed yet. And deep down, maybe I didn't want it to. Because certain truths, when they finally come to light, don't fade with time. They stay there, suspended in the air, waiting for the right moment to reveal what still remains to be said. Time, little by little, began to reveal the true magnitude of what had happened. The will wasn't just a document read before an incredulous audience. It was a watershed moment that altered destinies. The family, which had always believed itself untouchable, began to fall apart from within. The fights that had previously been confined to the background now spilled out onto the streets, to lawyers, and onto social media. The masks fell one by one, and the name they so desperately sought to protect became a source of shame. I watched it all from afar, with the serenity of someone who had already learned the value of silence. But none of this brought me immediate joy. On the contrary, there was a bittersweet feeling in seeing justice served. It wasn't revenge, it was recognition. Like the dawn after a long storm, beautiful, yet still tinged with sadness. I came to understand that every action has a price, and the price of truth is always loneliness. Even so, something within me blossomed. A new kind of strength, quiet yet firm. The bakery I opened with my inheritance started small, with a smell of freshly baked cake wafting over the sidewalk and the door always open. At first, only a few customers came, some curious, others wary. But within a week, the aroma of fresh coffee and hot pastry had taken over the neighborhood. It was beautiful to see people arriving shyly and leaving smiling, taking a piece of my story with them with each slice of cake. That kitchen, simple and full of warmth, became the opposite of the cold mansion where I'd lived half my life. Sometimes I'd see familiar faces passing by on the street, pretending not to recognize me. And that was okay. I no longer needed recognition from those who'd never seen me. What nourished me now was a different kind of gaze, that of the women who'd come in, order a coffee, and tell me their own stories. Stories of disdain, of exclusion, of heavy silences. I listened to each one attentively, because I saw in them pieces of the woman I once was. And with every word exchanged, I felt something change not only in me, but in them as well. The deceased's daughters still tried to rebuild their social standing, throwing expensive parties and parading fake smiles at events. But behind the photos and new clothes, cracks were visible. People began to drift away, business deals fell apart, and the surname that once opened doors became synonymous with scandal. It was as if fate had decided to balance the scales, giving each person the weight they deserved to carry. Meanwhile, I moved on unhurriedly. The mornings smelled of sugar and hope. With each batch, I remembered what the old man said. Working with your hands is the most beautiful way to thank life. And perhaps that's what I was doing, giving thanks. Not for being chosen in the will, but for having survived in gratitude without becoming bitter. Many who meet me today are amazed by my calm demeanor. Some ask me if I don't feel vindicated. I smile and leave the answer hanging in the air. Because some things can't be explained, they can only be understood when experienced. And perhaps that's why, when reading or hearing a story like this, so many people recognize themselves. And who knows, perhaps feel compelled to share in the comments what this journey awakens in each of them. The bakery has grown. People who once ignored me now bring flowers, order sweets, ask for advice. But what truly sustains me isn't the money coming in, but the certainty that, somehow, life has given me back what was taken from me, the right to exist out loud. And even with all this apparent peace, I feel there's still something to come. As if fate, that old craftsman, still has one more piece to fit together before completing the painting. Time began to shape everything around me in a strange way. The bakery, once a timid venture, now pulsed like a living organism. The sound of the mixer mingled with the laughter of the customers, the sweet steam of melting sugar fogged the window, and I, behind the counter, watched the comings and goings of people with the feeling that I was, finally, in the right place. But even amidst this new routine, there was something inside me that remained restless. A silent part, still observing the past from afar, like someone watching a wound that refuses to fully heal. Sometimes life seemed too generous, and I suspected it. There were days when everything flowed with an almost absurd harmony. The coffee was perfectly brewed, the flowers in the window bloomed with the sun, the children ran between the tables as if the space belonged to them. And then, suddenly, a shadow would creep in. A letter with no return address. A gaze lingering too long on the street. The premonition that tranquility, like sugar, could dissolve with a simple touch of hot water. It was on one of those afternoons, when the sun gilded the neighborhood tiles, that his youngest daughter appeared at the door. She wore the same arrogant look, but now mixed with something new, fear. She asked for some candy just to hide it, but her hands trembled as she held the napkin. She didn't talk about inheritance or a will. She spoke of emptiness, of the loneliness that hung in the big house, of the silence that now weighed more heavily than my presence had before. And in that moment, I realized that their punishment wouldn't come from me, but from the very echo of their own choices. The conversation was brief, but it left a lasting impression on me. Because for the first time I saw something beyond arrogance in her. I saw the fragility of someone who, for her entire life, has confused privilege with love. She left without looking back, and the sound of her heels echoing on the asphalt stuck in my memory, like the end of a chapter one still don't know if I want to reread. That night, I sat alone at the bakery table, the smell of freshly baked bread filling the air. Outside, the wind swayed the awning, and the streetlights reflected in the puddles left by the rain. There was a strange calm within me, as if each small gesture, wiping the counter, folding the cloths, turning out the lights, was a silent rite of thanks. But there was also something I couldn't quite name. A sense that the cycle hadn't yet completely closed, that the name that had once been read aloud at the wake still carried a weight I didn't fully understand. In the following days, messages, invitations, and proposals began to arrive. People wanted to transform my story into an example, into news, into a symbol. I was grateful, but I refused. Because what I experienced wasn't a spectacle. It was survival. It was the sum total of silences, humiliations, and choices no one saw. And what I achieved wasn't glory, it was peace. Still, it was impossible to deny. Something had changed, not just in the way they saw me, but in the way I saw the world. As I closed the bakery doors one night, the distant sound of thunder stopped me. I looked up at the dark sky and felt the same chill I'd felt the day of the wake. It was a premonition, a mixture of fear and intuition. Because sometimes life seems to repeat itself in cycles, like a melody that returns in different notes. And I knew deep down that a new chapter was about to be written, even if I didn't yet know what role fate would have in store for me this time. The days that followed that visit left me restless. It was as if the past had found a new way in, now disguised as regret. Her presence, however brief, shook everything I thought was resolved. At night, I found myself replaying every detail of the conversation. The lost look, the wavering tone, the trembling hands trying to hide a pain that was perhaps older than pride itself. There was something in that woman's voice that made me realize, no one gets away with hurting someone who only wanted to exist in peace. The bakery was still busy, and the sound of the customers' laughter still warmed me, but the thought of her followed me like a subtle shadow. Sometimes, as I sprinkled sugar over the cakes, I saw the reflection of my own life in that white powder. Sweet, yes, but too light, ready to melt away with the first breath of wind. Because deep down I knew that everything I'd achieved could still be shaken. All it took was a movement, a memory, an unexpected visit. The neighborhood felt different too. People looked at me with a mixture of respect and curiosity. Some called me a role model, others studied me from afar, as if my life were a warning. And even without meaning to, I had become a symbol, not of heritage, but of silent resistance. The woman who had once been expelled from the wake now had her story told in admirable whispers, but I wondered if being remembered this way was truly freedom, or just another form of imprisonment. Sometimes I would wake before sunrise, sit on the porch, and watch the sky slowly lighten. The colors changed as if someone were hand-painting them, from gray to pink, from rose to gold. There was beauty in that process, but also uncertainty. Because every dawn brings the promise of a new day, and every promise, even a bright one, carries within it the shadow of what might not come to pass. I would take a deep breath and try to convince myself that life was finally on track. Still, there was a voice inside me, ancient and insistent, that whispered that nothing ever ends completely. His daughters remained publicly silent, but the news continued to trickle in. Cases lost, properties sold in haste, businesses collapsing like houses of cards. The town is small and stories travel fast. But I wasn't celebrating. Somehow, I felt like fate was taking care of what I could never handle with my own hands. And paradoxically, this brought me peace and discomfort at the same time. Because there's a strange melancholy in seeing justice served without having to watch it firsthand. One night, I found an envelope on the bakery counter with no return address. Inside was just an old photograph. Me, still young, serving coffee in the living room of the main house. Behind the photo, a short sentence, written in a firm hand. He always knew. I stood there, staring at that image that froze time. The face I saw was that of a woman weary, yet still hopeful. And the sentence, though brief, seemed to carry the weight of everything yet unsaid. I put the photo away in the drawer, but its meaning stayed with me for days to come. He always knew. Of what exactly? Of injustice, of loneliness, of the love that perhaps could never be named. This question lingered in my mind like the distant sound of a bell that never stops ringing. And it was in this silence filled with questions that I realized. Perhaps the story didn't end with the will, nor with the bakery. Perhaps there was something still hidden, something waiting for the right moment to surface. Because the past, no matter how buried, always finds a way to breathe again. The morning after that photograph, the sun seemed different. The light streamed through the bakery window with a delicacy I hadn't seen in a long time, as if the day somehow wanted to tell me everything was in place. I prepared the coffee more slowly, smelling the grounds mingling with the air. Every gesture seemed charged with new meaning. Life, after all, has these ironies. It reveals itself in the little things when we're tired of looking for answers in the big ones. I picked up the photo again. The woman I saw there seemed like a different person. So different and, at the same time, so me. In that tired face, I saw the root of everything that had transformed me. He had always known. The words echoed again, but now without weight. Perhaps he knew how much I had endured in silence, how much I had resisted even when they wanted to erase me. Perhaps, somehow, he had tried to make amends with what he could. A final gesture, a legacy, an acknowledgement. And as I gazed at the portrait, I felt a wave of peace wash over me. The bakery gradually filled up. The laughter, the clatter of dishes, the sound of the doorbell. And I realized how life is renewed in the ordinary. How joy resides in the repetitions of everyday life. When the sugar melts in the pan, when the bread rises in the oven, when someone thanks you with a smile. All of this was the opposite of the big house. There, no one needed to hide who they were to be accepted. Suddenly, I realized that it wasn't just me who had been transformed by that story. The people I passed by were changing too. Women who had once been silent now spoke of their pain, their new beginnings, their courage. Older men shared regrets they'd never confessed. It was as if what happened to me had opened an invisible space for others to see themselves. And realizing this, I understood the true meaning of what I'd experienced. Nothing was in vain. The past hasn't disappeared. It's just changed form. It's on the walls of the bakery, in the stories I hear, in the way I look at the world now. Before, I thought justice was the end. Today, I understand it's only the beginning. True justice is being able to exist without needing to ask permission. Sometimes at night, when I close the doors and the scent of sugar still lingers in the air, I imagine he's still passing by, that he watches the movement, the glow of the lamps reflecting in the shop windows, and smiles silently. And if it's true, I think he'd be proud. Because of all the things I could have left behind, the most valuable was this sense of continuity, as if his story were somehow still breathing through mine. Many people ask me what I've learned from all this. I always say the same thing. I've learned that respect isn't begged for, it's earned. That the love that comes from dignity is the only love that never fades. And that sometimes you have to go through the hell of contempt to discover the power of your own voice. If this story touched you, if at some point you saw yourself reflected in it, let that become a gesture, like, comment, share. Because every word exchanged here keeps alive this chain of strength and truth that connects us, even from a distance. Today, when I think about that day I was thrown out of the wake, I realize that it was there that I began to be born again. The woman who bowed her head at that door was left behind. The one who entered later, even though she was pushed, even though she was humiliated, was the one who discovered the value of her own name. And that's what I leave for those listening to me now. Don't accept anything less than respect. The true happy ending isn't being accepted. It's being remembered with pride, as someone who chose dignity even when the world tried to deny it.